Welcome to Wild Side, your wild true crime podcast.
We're your hosts, who are sisters, storytellers, and truth seekers.
I'm Bailey, a therapist who is fascinated by all weird and dark human behaviors.
And I'm Chelsea, an educator here to unearth the facts behind the cases.
We cover true crime because some cases are just too dark to forget,
and others are too wild to ignore.
We're so glad you're here, so buckle up
and enjoy the ride. What is up, Wildsiders?
What's up, what's up?
So I have to say, when I say wild cider, it makes me think of apple cider, which makes me think of fall. And it gives me all the goody feels.
The warm and fuzzies.
The warm and fuzzies, because I do love this time of year.
Yeah, it's the burr months, right?
You love the burrs.
September, October, November, December, my favorites.
Well, as you guys, I don't know if you know, maybe you don't, but it is interview week. And we will be releasing an interview that we had with Bailey.
Samantha.
And Samantha is a therapist who specializes in...
Chelsea doesn't even remember this stuff. Sorry, guys. So our interview this week is with Samantha. She was a CSAT, and she also, for a period of her career, worked with adolescent offenders. And so I know it's kind of been a heavy month for interviews, but here we are. And so this week we're going to have that interview drop on Friday. And she talks a little bit about like her perspective from a clinical lens on offenders. And that segues us into a brief update about this case. Chelsea was kind of the heavy hitter on this one. She did a lot of the research and I helped a little bit, but not very much. But
yeah,
from my understanding, it was difficult because when you're looking for cases with like adolescent offending behaviors, a lot of it's sealed. A lot of those cases are sealed.
Yes. So a lot of it is sealed. And the stuff that is not sealed, the names are kept anonymous, which is understandable. Or the third option is you have a handful of cases that made national news, however many years ago, and they've kind of been covered extensively. And we like to, I don't know, we're more of an underdog podcast. We like to look for cases that are a little bit off the beaten path. So we did find one that we're going to talk about today, but just so you guys are fully aware, there's not a ton of information on this specific case. We're going to talk more about just offending behavior in that adolescent age group, that adolescent population, more than the actual case. So we will cover a case and we'll get into as much of the details as we could find. Again, a lot of it was sealed, but the majority of it will be kind of the data and the stigmas around adolescent to offend. And that's actually more interesting and more sticky than the case itself.
Right.
Are some of the red tapes around this stuff.
It's definitely an interesting case. So this might not be one of our longer episodes, but again, it's just kind of working with the obstacles that we have when it comes to minors, right? Minors and the reporting around it and that's available and that kind of thing.
Yes. Yeah. This one actually has there's a lot of moving parts to this case. So I just want to say our focus again is adolescents and offensive behavior. specifically sexually offensive behavior. But again, there are a lot of very hot topics that we're going to cover in this case. And
Yeah,
just know that our focus is on adolescents and behavior.
that's right. So without further ado, this is the case of Hunter Heckel and some of the weird, gross stuff that goes along with it. You ready, Freddie?
Let's do it.
Here we go. In the spring of 2021, Loudoun County, Virginia was already simmering. School board meetings had devolved into shouting matches over pandemic closures and a new policy expanding bathroom access for transgender students. Then, on May 28th, a 16-year-old student sexually assaulted a classmate in a girls' restroom at Stonebridge High School. 5 months later, after being transferred to Broad Run High School, the same teenager assaulted another girl. Both attacks occurred inside schools that prided themselves on safety protocols and progressive reputation. When juvenile authorities confirmed that the same youth, later publicly identified as Hunter Heckel, was responsible for both assaults, the narrative metastasized. Parents demanded resignations, national commentators descended, protesters filled board meetings carrying signs about boys in skirts. Few paused to note that under Virginia law, Heckel was still a minor, subject to sealed proceedings intended to balance accountability with the possibility of rehabilitation. By autumn, however, that nuance had vanished beneath a tidal wave of moral panic.
Sociologist Stanley Cohen once described moral panic as the moment when a society's anxiety is channeled into the condemnation of a deviant, transforming one person's acts into proof that civilization itself is under siege. Loudoun County became a textbook case. The assaults occurred precisely as national politics fixated on gender identity and parental rights. Cable pundits reframed the incidents as evidence that inclusive bathroom policies endangered girls. Local officials, constrained by confidentiality laws, could say little, and silence was read as complicity. Within weeks, petitions circulated demanding that Superintendent Scott Ziegler be fired when he insisted that no assaults had occurred, quote, in our bathrooms. Before correcting himself days later, public trust imploded. The facts, 2 assaults, 1 perpetrator, both adjudicated in juvenile court, were real. Yet, the broader narrative no longer cared about precision. It was now about what people feared schools might be following. For the families of the victims, the spectacle compounded trauma. One father, later arrested after an emotional outburst at a school board meeting, told reporters, "They care more about the policies than our kids." The phrase captured the country's fracture: safety versus inclusion, outrage versus procedure, each side accusing the other of betrayal.
Because Hunter Heckel was a minor, the judicial process that followed the Loudoun County assaults unfolded behind the closed doors of Virginia's juvenile system. There were no public hearings, no released transcripts, and no sentencing memorandum, only fragments pieced together by reporters and court observers, kind of how it feels in today's episode. What emerged was a partial portrait of accountability conducted in secrecy. In late 2021, the Commonwealth's Attorney's Office filed 2 petitions of delinquency, Virginia's juvenile equivalent of criminal charges, stemming from the assaults at Stonebridge High School and Broad Run High School. Both cases were heard by Judge Pamela Brooks, who presided without a jury, as state law requires for minors. Then a few months later, in October 2021, Heckel was found guilty of forcible sodomy and forcible fellatio in connection with the first assault, and was later adjudicated on additional charges for the second. Now, because Hunter was 16 at the time of the offenses, prosecutors petitioned to have him tried as an adult. Judge Brooks denied the transfer, citing developmental considerations and the belief that the juvenile system could still provide meaningful rehabilitation. That decision, though arguably legally standard, naturally triggered widespread outrage among parents. And these parents who believed the severity of the crimes really demanded an adult sentence. So the court ordered Heckel to a residential treatment program within Virginia's juvenile correction system. And then this was followed by probation, counseling, and educational requirements. The disposition included specialized sex offense therapy and psychological monitoring until his 18th birthday. Upon review in early 2024, after successful completion of treatment, the court then determined that Hunter Heckel had fulfilled his obligations. He was released from probationary supervision and was not placed on the adult sex offender registry, which is consistent with Virginia Code 16.1-299, which ultimately seals most juvenile records upon completion. Now, this outcome to many felt intolerable, but to professionals within the juvenile justice field, it was rather predictable and a predictable application of precedent and developmental science. Since Roper versus Simons in 2005 and Graham versus Florida in 2010, the U.S. Supreme Court has recognized that adolescents differ fundamentally from adults. How do you think they're different? Well, lots of ways. Adolescents are more impulsive. We all know this. They're more susceptible to peer influence. They're less capable of foresight. And crucially, they are more capable of change. The human prefrontal cortex, the area of our brain that is really important and the main contributor in governing judgment and inhibition, it obviously continues developing into our mid to late 20s. These findings underpin the philosophy of juvenile confidentiality. Protect the public through structured intervention now, while preserving the adolescent's potential for rehabilitation later. Yet the secrecy, however principled, it really starts to breed suspicion. And in Loudoun, each sealed record became a blank page onto which the public projected its fears. Was Hunter remorseful or remorseless? Was treatment merely leniency in disguise? With no real answers, rumors filled the void. And when news of Heckel's release surfaced, victims' families learned of it not from the court, but through the media, which I think is just an awful way to learn about it. And there was an omission that reignited anger in the local system, the state system, and the federal system. The silence required by law, intended to safeguard youth identity, instead amplified the community's fear and grief.
And I think that really is kind of that's the crux in these situations, right? The law is required to be quiet. Court cases are sealed to protect identities. But then the victims are also in this state of grief and wanting to know, right? What is this going to look like for the community? The Loudoun County community's reaction to the assaults revealed a county caught between grief, anger, and disbelief. For the families of the victims, frustration with the justice system and school officials quickly turned to outrage. And when news broke that Hunter Heckel had been released from residential treatment upon turning 18, Smith, which is one of the families of the victims, Smith and her family learned of it only through, again, media reports, which felt like another betrayal to the family. This lack of communication symbolized everything that had gone wrong: secrecy disguised as procedure, and bureaucracy mistaken for care. The Loudoun County Commonwealth's Attorney Office, led by Buddha Bibaraj, defended the decision, stating that the process followed, quote, the law as written, and that evaluations indicated, quote, low ongoing risk after treatment completion. But for many residents, the contrast between the gravity of the assaults and the limited visibility of their consequences reinforced a sense of systematic indifference. Other parents voiced similar grief. The mother of another victim alleged that school officials urged her daughter, quote, not to talk about it, an instruction that deepened the trauma it sought to contain. Community members echoed the family's pain, describing the district's handling of the assaults as ineptitude of all involved. In public meetings, parents demanded not vengeance, mind you, but transparency, pleading for acknowledgement, honesty, and, more importantly, reform. One parent was quoted saying, "We don't want revenge. We want truth, transparency, and the guarantee that no other parent will sit in my chair." Their collective voices captured the essence of institutional betrayal, the psychological injury that occurs when systems designed for protection instead become sources of harm. What began as an individual act of violence evolved into a moral reckoning for an entire community, forcing Loudoun County to confront the widening gap between bureaucratic procedure and human suffering. The controversy surrounding Heckel's release ultimately encapsulated a deeper national question. Should juvenile justice prioritize accountability or rehabilitation when the crime is sexual and violent? For some, the court ruling represented faith in science and the possibility for change. For others, it signaled a justice system more empathetic to offenders than to victims. The truth, as ever, lay uncomfortably in between, a legal and moral landscape navigating the fault line between youth and responsibility, with no verdict capable of satisfying everyone.
Now, to understand what happened inside those bathrooms to those girls, or at least what developmental science can say about similar acts, we must enter really uncomfortable territory. And basically, this is how adolescents think about sex, power, and consequence. Psychologist Lawrence Steinberg's research shows that teenage decision-making is, quote, a paradox of competence. In calm settings, adolescents' reasoning compares somewhat to adults, but under emotional arousal or peer pressure, impulse overrules logic. Sexual aggression among adolescents oftentimes emerges not from necessarily predatory intent, but from immature empathy, entitlement scripts, or poor impulse regulation that is amplified by opportunity. Now, I think that sentence, sexual aggression among adolescents, a lot of times emerges not from predatory intent, but immature empathy, entitlement scripts, or poor impulse regulation amplified by opportunity. I think that would give a lot of people pause, and I think naturally would get really defensive. But let's be super clear, that framework, that perspective, or that argument never excuses the harm. All it's doing is simply locating it within a developmental process rather than an adult pathology. Many offenders, according to studies, have experienced prior trauma, neglect, or inconsistent discipline. They misread cues and seek control in distorted ways. Treatment then must re-educate both cognition and emotion, teaching empathy, self-regulation, and consent in a brain still under construction. Now, in Hunter Heckel's case, the court ordered residential treatment, and this implied that evaluators saw the potential for change. Now, what that treatment entailed, the daily work of confronting behavior, tracing triggers, and building self-control, again, all of that remains sealed, and that's why we don't have a lot of the details of this case. But the fact of placement itself reflects a judicial belief that rehabilitation, and not strictly warehousing, offers the best chance of preventing future harm.
You know, and I think, again, I feel like you can understand both sides of that fence, right? Both sides of that issue. You can read the research. You can know if you work around, or if you are ever around adolescents. Yes, they are all those things. They're impulsive. They're all the things. But then, as you know, a lot of times you'll hear people say like, but my mama side of me, you know, my mama heart in me is like, I don't care. I don't care who you are. You know, if you assaulted my baby in a bathroom
or
anywhere, right? Like, I would be absolutely livid. I would want them to throw the book. I would want them to be registered as a sex offender. And I have to admit, like, I thought that until I started really researching this case. And I think it really does kind of open your eyes to the reality of dealing with adolescents, and the reality that, yeah, their brain is still developing. And like Bailey talked about, a lot of times there is a history of abuse that they've been exposed to.
Yeah. And, you know, I think this point is going to be the most contentious point for most of you guys listening, because, you know, Chelsea and I say it in just about every episode, is just because something bad happened to you in your life does not give you, you know, an excuse or just justify your awful behaviors towards other humans. There are millions of people in this world who've had really awful, traumatic childhoods, and they don't predate on other people, right? And so I think my only reservation is, I think there's still a lot of research to be had and to be done, right? I think that we know more than we did 60 years ago, but in the next 60 years, I think we're going to know 100 times more. You know what I mean?
Yes. But I mean, we really need to look at and talk about the elephant in the room, and that is the sex offender registry, right? That's so often what people are wanting as a safeguard to making sure that this won't happen again, is that these people are put on a registry. And this is where I have to say, I feel more confused after researching this than I did before, because now it's really hard, because there are really good points, and we're going to get into that. So to the public, rehabilitation can feel indistinguishable from absolution, right? Now, the sex offender registry, it was created in the 1990s, fun fact, for adult predators, and it has become a moral shorthand. If someone's name isn't there, he must have escaped justice, right? But juvenile registration raises profound ethical and empirical concerns. So the U.S. Department of Justice's research arm, the acronym is SOMAPI, SOMAPI, and it notes that youth who complete evidence-based treatment recidivate at rates far below adults, and that public registration may actually increase risk by isolating them from schooling and employment. The logic of the registry permanently warning clashes with the science of adolescence, which emphasizes plasticity and desistance. So essentially, the argument is if these adolescents are put on a sex offender registry, that is going to greatly impede their development, not only socially, but emotionally, because that's going to follow them through school. It's going to follow them into adulthood over, hopefully a mistake that happened when they were still in a developmental phase. But still, victims and families understandably crave visible accountability. The challenge is to reconcile those needs. So, how to reassure a community without foreclosing a teenager's ability to change? That's a hard thing to do. And Loudoun County never really found that balance. Instead, it oscillated between, again, secrecy and spectacle, each fueling the other.
And that's something really hard for me talking about what you were saying, Chelsea, is that the research shows that specifically in adolescents, if they complete an evidence-based treatment, they reoffend at lower rates, far below adults.
Correct.
And that public registration may actually increase their risk of reoffending. And that's difficult because, Chelsea has teenagers. I have a 4-year-old, and just the idea of, my niece or nephew or my daughter at some point in their life having a friend who maybe, like Hunter Heckel, had sexually assaulted people, and now their records expunged. There's no registry to do like a background search on this person. You know what I mean?
Right.
I'm very, very, very split with that. Like, I hear the research from my clinical brain side of me. I understand what that means. But from a personal perspective and protective viewpoint, I don't like not being able to find that information or have access to it or be aware of it. Does that make sense?
Right. Sure. Well, and something that we haven't talked about, a detail that we haven't talked about yet in this case, is not only did Hunter Heckel assault these girls, but again, he was in a female restroom. He was also wearing a skirt. He was also cross-dressing. And that really adds another layer to what the heck? What do we do? How is the community going to, no wonder, right? Obviously, I can see why the community was so up in arms over this.
Yeah. Yeah, there are a lot of moving components, especially saying that this case just happened in the last 1 to 4 years, in the span of the last 4 years. And we've been at the height of kind of a social crossroads when it comes to the LGBTQ plus community and then the transgender piece. You know what I mean?
Right.
So this is kind of all happening at the same time.
Right. Yeah.
So kind of getting back into this, no phrase captured the county's rupture there in Virginia better than the slogan painted on protest place cards, which was "Protect Our Girls." It was both an urgent plea and an accusation that officials had valued ideology over safety, which, again, we were just kind of touching on that 30 seconds ago. In reality, the unsealed investigation found no evidence that bathroom policy caused or enabled the assaults. Rather, bureaucratic inertia and miscommunication did. But by then, nuance was unsellable. National media framed the case as proof that progressive gender policies endangered youth. The teenagers involved became avatars, which it was weird, we were just talking about that in last week's case. The victims, the teenagers involved in this case, became avatars in a cultural war that they never asked to be a part of. And from a sociological lens, this is labeling theory in motion. So once an individual or event acquires a deviant label, so in this case, the, skirt-wearing predator, the negligent school district, etc., the label organizes perception more powerfully than the evidence does. And for Hunter Heckel, this meant that his name would circulate online long after juvenile anonymity should have shielded him. And for the victims, it meant that their suffering was subsumed into arguments about bathrooms rather than trauma care for them. And similarly, for the community, it meant policy debates that were eclipsing the more important and quieter work around prevention.
So, philosopher Erik Erikson described adolescence on the stage of identity versus role confusion. And he kind of puts it this way. Adolescence is a time of experimentation where boundaries are tested to learn where they hold. In rare tragic cases, those tests come into criminal harm. The justice system then faces an impossible calibration: how to hold a young person accountable without freezing him forever in that moment of his worst act. And I really have to agree on that one. And maybe it's just because I do have such a heart for that adolescent age group, but man, it's to be around adolescents. They really make some really, really bad decisions.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, they do.
And
we did too, right? At that
we all
age.
did. Yeah. And I don't want them to be frozen in that moment of their worst act. I think that was a brilliant way to put that. So the neuroscientific consensus that, quote, kids are different provides one answer, possibly. The raw anguish of victims provides another, right? So again, this duality of what's going on, the tension between them is the beating heart of juvenile justice. And Loudoun County's tragedy lies not only in the assaults themselves, but in the way adults, meaning the parents, the officials, the commentators, struggled and often failed to navigate that tension with honesty and restraint. Because like Bailey said, so often it was boiled down to, almost this comic book take of like the skirt-wearing predator, in this big, bad, negligent district, which, are they true? Those are true statements. But can it be pinpointed down to just that? I think there's more involved in that.
Yeah.
I feel like you're eye-rolling, Bailey.
I listen, this is difficult for me, and I think probably everybody listening, because when I heard you talk about let's make sure that they're not frozen forever because of a bad decision, literally what my brain gave me was the case of, this was 10 years ago, of Brock Turner.
Oh, yeah.
where the judge was like, we don't want to ruin this kid's life because of like one bad decision. And I remember just being like, that's not how it works, right? Like,
I
that's not
know.
exactly appropriate. And so, yeah, I mean, this is uncomfortable even in the context of us recording a true crime episode, and I don't even have all of the details, right?
Right.
All we know are that there were 2 female victims of this boy in high school.
Yeah, he's
And
16 years old. He was 16 years old when he committed the
so he's
act.
probably a, sophomore, junior age. And he assaults one girl in a bathroom at school.
At school.
And then 6 months later, because they transfer him out of the school, he does it again.
Yeah.
And that's not a bad decision. That's now we're starting into a pattern.
Yeah.
And so I have, and to be super clear, you guys, I am a therapist and I have worked with non-adjudicated sex offenders, but not adolescent age. So I am outside of my depth with this specific, population. I don't know all of the research. I don't have anecdotal clinical experience with this. And I'm starting to realize the more we do these cases, the more out of depth I am without the clinical expertise, like the more uncomfortable I get, which I think is pretty normal.
Right.
So yeah, I'm just having a hard time with it all. And I think this is why it's easier to point blame and deflect naturally than like get down to the nitty-gritty root of the issue.
Sure.
Right.
Well, and that's why Bailey and I chose this case, because all of the research shows us that they are less likely to offend if they go through, evidence-based, scientifically backed treatment. But man, I mean, that,
Yeah.
and also the research shows that they usually are not reoffenders. They usually have an isolated incidence. But I mean, what can we say about Hunter Heckel? I mean, within 6 months, Bailey, like Bailey just said, and did it in the same way. It's almost like he's taunting people.
Yeah, this is an uncomfortable one, guys. And so this is the thing as far as the treatment around adolescent sex offenders. Behind the closed doors of treatment programs like the one that Hunter Heckel was ordered to attend, therein lies a difficult truth about how we handle, young people, teenagers who commit sexual offenses. The public, and rightfully so, or understandably so, the public often wants certainty. I want proof that this teenager will never harm another human again. But again, rehabilitation programs, therapy, psychology, it does not deal in guarantees. When I worked inpatient rehab for substance abuse and sex addiction, I would see it all the time from families. I'm paying this money and they're coming to your program that is highly recommended, and I pretty much want to guarantee that they're not going to drink again or they're not going to cheat again. And you can't do that. You just can't give that guarantee.
Right.
And so this whole treatment process, it deals in progress and growth and reducing the risk, right? Reducing the risk of relapse, reoffending, or whatever. Rehabilitation is not perfect. And when it's done with structure and empathy, usually it works better than punishment alone. Effective programs usually combine several types of therapy. So you have kind of the main hitting ones like cognitive behavioral therapy. This helps teenagers challenge these harmful thoughts like blaming victims or minimizing the harm that they caused. And it builds self-awareness, it minimizes denial, builds empathy, and helps with their self-control. Then you have like multi-systemic therapy, which looks beyond the individual and it addresses the kind of ripple effect, the family conflict, peer influence, and the school struggles. So really kind of individualizing everything, but on a multi-level perspective.
Yeah.
Parents are often involved directly, learning how to reinforce changes at home. And what studies are showing is that this kind of treatment can cut off reoffending rates by as much as 70% compared to standard probation. Residential programs like the one Hunter Heckel completed are more intensive, offering daily therapy, structured schooling, and close supervision. These programs, the goal is to strengthen the impulse control and prepare the adolescent for re-entry into society and to not reoffend. But the argument here is simply locking them away can backfire. Without therapy, these offenders, especially teenage offenders, risk learning worse behaviors from others. That's why the most effective programs combine accountability with healing, recognizing that many offenders were also victims of trauma themselves, and so healing and responsibility go hand in hand and must happen together. And that goes back to something I say in almost every episode whenever I'd work with offending behavior is, it was an equally half of a sentence. I'm sorry that X, Y, and Z happened to you at whatever age. And that's not an excuse, and we cannot allow yourself to continue hurting other people, right? And so basically all of this to say is research, all of the research, you guys, says that these approaches that we've talked about, that's the best way to go. There was a large review of nearly 3,000 youth done, and it found a 12% reoffense rate for those who completed treatment, which was about half of that of the untreated peer group. Most juvenile offenders are not lifelong predators, like Chelsea said, but troubled adolescents acting out in harmful ways. And I think that's the hardest pill to swallow, if you will, especially looking at it through the lens of a victim's family. The key factor in success is completion. Those who stay in treatment and continue support afterward are far less likely to reoffend. Rehabilitation, then, is not a quick fix, but like everything, an ongoing process, imperfect, demanding, and still arguably very human.
For the two girls assaulted by Hunter Heckel, the aftermath wasn't a headline. It was a lifelong process. Victims of adolescent sexual assault face unique challenges. Classmates gossiping, reminders in familiar hallways, and hearing their pain used as political talking points. Psychologists call this secondary victimization, when the reaction of others deepens the trauma. And Bailey, I think that's kind of a point that we sometimes forget, that we don't want this perpetrator to be frozen in that moment, but we forget that the victims often are frozen in that moment.
Yeah, that's that's part of the problem I have with that perspective, right?
Right. And especially with it happening within the school, if the victims decided to continue school there, can you imagine every time you go into the bathroom, even walking down the hall, or smelling a certain smell, or just people talking, you're always going to have people who are like, oh, I bet she had some part of it, like that victim shaming that you can sometimes see in cases. So kind of on a side note, there was an independent investigation, and it found that the Loudoun County Public Schools violated federal Title IX requirements, and that was failing to notify parents quickly, delaying protection plans, and mishandling communications. And those right there, those are those bureaucratic issues that we talked about, those delays that happened, those seemingly procedural carried some pretty heavy emotional weight, obviously, to the victims and their family. And it really signaled to these families and the people in the community just gross neglect, right? By them really not giving it the weight and the attention that it needed quickly, right? In true survivor-centered care, that means acting fast, staying transparent, and acknowledging harm. And no amount of therapy or rehabilitation for the offender can undo institutional failures in the system itself, which appeared to the community indifferent.
The pain that followed in Loudoun County was not unique. Other communities have stood in the same crossfire between adolescent transgression and institutional failure, along with public panic surrounding it. Each time, the story begins with a single act of harm, and it expands into a referendum on what society believes about youth safety and redemption. So there was a case in Steubenville, Ohio, where there were two high school football players and they assaulted a teenage girl at a party in 2012. And this happened while other classmates filmed the attack and then posted it online, which is just horrific. The community's initial reaction was very, very familiar to the one in Virginia. There was silence, disbelief, and then a rush to protect the school's reputation. And it was only after the video spread across social media did the outrage finally start to eclipse the denial. And so in Steubenville, just like Loudoun County, it became a study of how adolescent cruelty can thrive inside adult complacency. And this is kind of described as moral disengagement, a process where empathy is overridden by group loyalty and a reputation to manage. This happened again in 1989 in the Central Park jogger case that most of us are very familiar with. How fear can erase youth entirely, right? And in that case, 5 teenage boys, Black, Latino, barely older than the Loudoun students. This time they were wrongfully convicted of rape after coercive interrogations. Years later, DNA evidence proved their innocence, but the damage was done. And their case remains a really haunting reminder that moral panic often tells us more about collective fear than about individual guilt. There are other instances where individuals who offend at some point in their childhood or their adolescence and then never reoffend and face the problems that we were talking about earlier of being ostracized and restricted as far as where they can live and jobs that they can have and that sort of thing. And across these stories runs a shared lesson that moral outrage is a super powerful unifier, but a poor teacher. Each community that we've talked about, Steubenville, New York, Palo Alto, and now Loudoun, was forced to reconcile these two conflicting and opposing truths. On one hand, you have the need for accountability, and the other side, you have the reality of adolescent complexity. Each discovered that vengeance may satisfy emotion, but it rarely prevents recurrence. What keeps communities safe is not the spectacle of punishment, but the quiet, sustained work of prevention, therapy, and institutional honesty. The difference between reform and repetition lies not in who shouts the loudest, but in who listens the longest.
The story of Hunter Heckel is not only about what he did, but about what everyone else did in response. A 16-year-old committed 2 acts of profound harm. Not excusable, not like, well, I mean, it really wasn't that bad. I mean, they were horrific acts of violence. The institutions charged with protection failed. The community, deprived of transparency, filled the void with rage. Somewhere between secrecy and spectacle lies the justice we just keep missing. The developmental sciences tell us that adolescents can change. The law tells us they must be held accountable in proportion to their maturity. The public demands protection and honesty. Balancing those imperatives is the work of justice in a fearful age. It requires courage, not the easy courage of punishment, but the harder one of discernment. And I think discernment is a great word because not every case is the same. And we have to see a child because these individuals are children. They're 16. They're children. They can cause devastation, yes, but they still might become something else. If Loudoun County teaches anything, it is that safety cannot be achieved by fear alone. It requires clarity, competence, and compassion. The willingness to understand before condemning, to fix systems before branding souls. For the victims, healing will take years. For Hunter Heckel, the years ahead will test whether the science of rehabilitation can withstand the politics of outrage. And for the rest of us, the test is simpler. Whether we can learn to tell the difference between justice and vengeance before another child's name becomes our next symbol.
And that, our dear listeners, is the awful adolescent offending case of Hunter Heckel. And I guess it was as comfortable as it was as uncomfortable for y'all as it was for us. Right, Chels?
Yeah. I mean, we obviously talk so often that our main goal with what we cover and what we talk about is we want to give listeners something to kind of chew on and something to think about. And like I said, I really was surprised by how much this case made me think. The ping pong match that happened inside my head. Because again, I was just like, oh man, that's true. I don't want his entire life to be ruined and blah, blah, blah. But then Bailey, like you bringing up the Brock Turner case, I was like, oh man. And that brought up a whole different silo of emotions, right? Where I'm like, I don't know, because yeah, he was 19 or something like that. But according to science, our prefrontal lobe it doesn't stop until it's not fully developed until we're in our mid to late 20s. So is he in the same category as a 16-year-old? Is he in the same category as a 14-year-old? And I think that's where that word discernment comes in. And I think that's the hardest part. That's the linchpin in all of this is you're at drastically different ages every single year. You know what I mean? 14 is radically different from a 16-year-old who's radically different from a 19-year-old.
I mean, it's just so difficult because the only thing I can pull on is my experience in addiction. And I guess probably a good comparison is I would have clients that would come in and they would be assigned to me and I would work with them for, if it was inpatient rehab for 30 days, 45 days, sometimes 60 days. And I would get to know them on a very personal, intimate level, right? Because intimacy, what I mean by that is into me, you see, right? A therapist-client relationship is a very intimate relationship, obviously. And I would get to know them and understand their inner traumas, their inner workings, their low self-esteem, their blah, 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 blah. And then it would be really interesting when I would meet with their family members, the ones who had stories of, their loved one, my client, being liars, cheaters, thieves, right? For years and years and years of being burned over and over again by this person. it took many years to strike that balance between having a lot of empathy for my clients and really having a heavy heart for their struggle, and also helping them see themselves as the quote unquote monster that a lot of times society saw them as because of their behavior and their active addiction. Right. And so a lot of my work, especially the more mature I became in my counseling approach, was like, I understand you and I see you, and that doesn't mean anything to the people you have burned 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 times before. Right.
Yeah. Right.
And so your work is being patient with them, not being patient with you, essentially. And is it fair? That's the question of this century when it comes to stuff like this, is like, nothing is ever that black and white. It's never that fair. And so I say all of that to say, I have no doubt that if I started working with adolescent sex offenders, I would just be like, I love this population. And that sounds wild to say, but I would be able to rehumanize them and see them in a different capacity and really understand things from a different angle than just standing on the outside where it's predator versus victim.
Right.
The good versus evil, like we talked about in the West Nickel Mines school shooting last week, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, and I do want to quickly add, and we'll talk about this more with the interview, but there's a difference between, violent sexual offending and and sexual offending that is less violent. Right. So there is inappropriate touching versus sodomy and rape and things like that. And I think I've learned this from Bailey, is that I think sometimes defining what type of offense that we're working with.
Yeah. That's a good point.
Really, that does make a difference.
Yeah.
But again, yeah, it's, oh gosh, it's just really, it's really hard. Sorry, I'm losing my train of thought with this. Give me just 1 second. Sorry. I have literally so many thoughts like swirling around in here. Oh, I'm sorry. I know what I was going to say. We can edit all that out. I think the one thing that I did take away from this, I don't feel like there are necessarily answers to a lot of the challenges and the predicaments that we're in. The one thing that I do feel that I took away from this is, whatever you do, if your child or your loved one is somebody who has sexually offended, please seek out help, right? Like, please seek out treatment, because all of this evidence that we've talked about and all the statistics has been hand in hand, again, with appropriate treatment. They're less likely to reoffend, if they go through appropriate treatment. So please don't brush this. Like, please don't sweep it under a rug. You don't have to, again, dehumanize them. You don't have to, remind them every day what a monster they are. But please seek out help.
Well, love is boundaries and accountability.
Yeah.
Love is not saying yes to everything and saying, sure, whatever you want. Love is, I love you too much to allow this behavior. I love you too much to allow, what you're doing and what you're saying and how you're treating me and how you're treating other people and how you're treating yourself. So, yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think most parents...
Bailey, what is it that you say that you've told clients in the past where it's like, I care for you, but I care more for your potential victim?
Yeah, when I've worked with the non-adjudicated offenders, it's, my priority, my number one priority is your potential future victims. So if that's always my priority is making sure that you don't have future victims, then that makes you my priority, right?
Yep.
And
absolutely.
They would understand that when I would explain it to them, as you are not my priority right now, not having future victims is my priority, which automatically by default makes you my priority.
Right.
So I will pour 100% into you because you deserve that, and your potential, hopefully non-potential future victims deserve that. You know what I mean?
So we can't give you answers on should juveniles be put on the sex registry. I don't know, right? There are so many things that at the end of the day, I don't know. But again, what I feel like I can say I do know after researching this, is there is help out there, and please seek out help.
Yeah. And make sure to tune in on Friday for our interview with Samantha, because I think it's going to mirror this case pretty well as far as like what we discuss in our kind of hot topics with it. And I think for me, I got to tap out. I'm pretty exhausted. So as always, you guys, thank you so much for hanging out with us through this emotionally tense, wild, crazy ride.
And as always, we'll catch you on the wild side.
Bye, guys.
Later, Gators.